My name is John Murphy. I actually serve as the president of the Austin chapter of Reasons to Believe. And Reasons to Believe is a national science faith think tank that is based in California. It has a Christian ministry that attempts to demonstrate that sound reason as well as the very latest scientific evidence continually support the existence of God and helps to validate our confidence in the truth of the Bible. And so we have a chapter in Austin, which I'm very proud to be a part of, and just wanted you to know about the chapter real quick. If you enjoy these type of live scholarly presentations, then I would like to invite you to consider coming to our chapter sometime. So afterwards, we have flyers that are up here on the altar that will give you more details about the location and what time we meet, but I thought I would go ahead and tease you a little bit and tell you about some upcoming meetings we have. So next month in December, we're going to have Dr. Sarah Salviander come and speak to us. Dr. Salviander is an astrophysicist, and she grew up in an atheist household. However, in her collegiate studies, in her scientific studies, she all of a sudden became struck by this discovery of the universal fine-tuning. And it really struck a nerve with her. And as she started to think through it, she became convinced that materialistic naturalism could not explain that. She finally became open to the idea of theism and would eventually become a Christian. She's going to be talking about what scientists really believe, because there is this perception that science is a strictly secular enterprise and that all scientists are atheists. Well, given her background, she's going to talk about this, and she's going to address this premise, and very much looking forward to her presentation. Then in January, we're going to have Dr. Ken Holgemuth down. He's a retired geologist, and he's going to be talking to us about the science of dating. He'll be talking about radiometric dating. He'll be talking about using ice cores, dendrochronology, I believe, which is tree rings, dating via tree rings. He's going to be talking about dating via lake varves and other methods. He's going to talk about their weaknesses and their strengths and when you can use them and rely on them and when they are used incorrectly and produce incorrect results. Very excited to have him down from Tulsa. And then in February, we're going to have Dr. John Tyler over, who's a professor of law at Houston Baptist University, and he's going to come over and talk about the trial of Galileo. Oftentimes in the public, the trial of Galileo is presented as this conflict between Bible and Scripture. He's going to appeal to the notes from the trial, and he's going to dispel that and point out that that trial was really a political trial. He got cross with the Pope. And you don't want to get cross with the Pope. And so, again, very excited about that. I have a strong sense of justice. And as a kid, I wanted to be a cop. I really wanted to be a Texas Ranger eventually. But today, I enjoy watching those crime shows that depict the various ways in which investigators are able to identify and catch and convict criminals. And perhaps one of my favorite shows is the Forensic Files. In this 30-minute show, they will describe a crime, and then they will detail some of the most interesting and fascinating forensic science that is used to gather evidence. And no matter how long the investigation takes, and sometimes they can span decades, at the end of each episode, you always get the whodunit and how. Now, anytime a body is discovered, there are always 4 different possible explanations which must be investigated. Did the person expire by natural causes? Was there some sort of accident? Was it intentionally self-inflicted? Or was an outside agent possibly responsible? Well, the investigators always start by looking at the evidence at hand and trying to determine which one of those 4 possibilities seems to be most likely. Now, sometimes natural explanations, such as a death due to natural causes or an accident, very satisfactorily explains the circumstances at hand. However, sometimes it seems much more credible that the work of an agent, whether that be self-inflicted or whether that is possibly the work of some other individual, is required in order to explain the evidence that has been gathered. Now, detectives are historical investigators, and almost all historical investigations rely upon a form of logic known as abductive reasoning. The New World Encyclopedia defines abductive reasoning as follows: abduction, or inference to the best explanation, is a method of reasoning in which one chooses the hypothesis that would, if true, best explain the relevant evidence. Abductive reasoning starts from a set of accepted facts, and it infers the most likely or the best explanations. At the end of each Forensic Files episode, they will summarize the findings through a dramatization. And very often the reenactment will begin with the narrator stating, "Prosecutors believe," and then they'll go on to detail the conclusions that have been reached based upon the evidence that has been gathered. And most all juries will render a conviction because they find the hypothesis presented by the prosecution to be the most compelling and the most rational given the facts of the case. Well, this evening we're going to be looking at the question, does God exist? Now, how we answer that question is likely going to affect how we address a lot of questions in regard to reality. How we answer this question is going to form a foundation in regard to some of the most important questions that we will ask and try and answer in life. We are simply unable to address the topics of origins or morality or hope or purpose without addressing this question first. Well, this evening, I would like to take a look at 4 lines of evidence which I believe demonstrate that an outside agent has been at work in this universe. In appealing to abductive reasoning, this is going to apply the existence of God to be the most compelling and the most rational conclusion given the evidence. Now, I'd like to begin by taking a look at one that many find to be the most persuasive, however, can also be one of the most misunderstood, especially among Christian lay people, and that is Big Bang cosmology. Now, many Christians mistakenly believe that the Big Bang is some sort of a naturalistic attempt in order to bypass God and explain the creation of the universe. That is a complete misunderstanding. Big Bang cosmology is the scientific theory and the confirmation of the creation of the universe. The theory says nothing about the cause of this creation. It merely points out that all matter, space, and time had a singular beginning at some point in the past. So think in terms of cause and effect. Okay? From a biblical point of view, we understand God to be the cause and the creation of the universe itself to be the effect. Big Bang cosmology confirms the effect. It confirms that all matter, space, and time had an origin, a beginning. It says nothing whatsoever about the cause. In the PBS Nova series, The Elegant Universe, the host Brian Greene elaborates on the enigma of the Big Bang from a naturalistic perspective. He notes, there's always been a couple of problems with the Big Bang theory. First, when you go back to the bang, the laws of physics break down. They just don't make any sense anymore. And on top of this, there's the bang itself. What exactly is that? And then chuckling, MIT physicist Alan Guth adds, well, that's actually a problem. Classic form of the Big Bang theory really says nothing about what banged, what happened before it banged, or what caused it to bang. Now, the scientific confirmation of the creation of the universe began when Einstein's theory of general relativity yielded the surprising result that the universe was expanding. So if you rewind the expansion of the universe, then the implications were that the universe had a beginning. Now, Einstein's own worldview kept him from initially accepting his own conclusions, and so he introduced this fudge factor in his equations so that it would continue to yield a static and eternal model of the universe. However, further scientific research continued to confirm his original formulation, and later on in his scientific career, he would confess that that fudge factor was his greatest scientific blunder. In the 1920s, the astronomer Edwin Hubble confirmed the expansion of the universe when he observed that the galaxies all appeared to be moving away from us. So like a balloon expanding with air, the universe appeared to be increasing in size. This meant that the universe could not be static or unchanging in size, as many people previously thought. The discovery of the expansion of the universe is considered to be one of the great intellectual revolutions of the 20th century. Now, in 1948, physicists predicted that if the Big Bang is true, then there should be some sort of a microwave background radiation left over from this creation event. So similar to the ripples of heat that flow out of an oven when you open it, there should be some sort of a microwave background radiation, or noise as some people call it, that would be detectable from this initial explosive creation event. Well, in 1965, the American physicists Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson literally stumbled across the confirmation of this background noise. They were using a radio receiver at Bell Laboratories, and they were having a difficult time eliminating this very weak signal that appeared to be coming from all over the sky. So they approached a couple of physicists at Princeton University to ask them, well, what is this? Can you tell what this is? Those physicists said, you may have just discovered confirmation of this microwave background radiation from the Big Bang event. They were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1978 for that discovery. From 1966 to 1970, the British astrophysicists Stephen Hawking, George Ellis, and Roger Penrose extended the equations of general relativity to also include space and time. Their papers showed that space and time must also have an origin that was coincident for that of all of matter. So in other words, if general relativity accurately describes the physics of the universe, then all matter, space, and even time itself would share a singular origin at some finite time in the past. Well, Big Bang cosmology had very obvious theological implications. It wasn't really lost on anyone. It was easily recognizable. The science writer Jim Holt writes about it in his book titled, Why Does the World Exist? He notes, as long as the universe was thought to be eternal, its existence did not greatly vex scientists. Einstein, in his theorizing, simply assumed the eternity of the universe, and he fudged his relativity equations accordingly. With the discovery of the Big Bang, however, everything changed. Both theory and empirical evidence pointed to the same verdict. The universe must have had an abrupt beginning in time. Churchmen rejoiced. Scientific proof of the biblical account of creation had, they believed, dropped into their laps. Those at the other ideological stream gnashed their teeth. In 1988, Stephen Hawking noted, many people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. And in an article titled Science and Religion Find Commonality in the Big Bang, science historian Frederick Berman noted that the community of scientists was prepared to consider the idea that God created the universe, quote, a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the last 100 years. And then finally, the astrophysicist and agnostic Robert Jastrow, in his book detailing the history of Big Bang theory and its confirmation, summarizes this way, astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven, by their own methods, that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace every star, every planet, every living thing in the cosmos and on Earth, and they have found that all of this has happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. If Big Bang cosmology is true, then it would seem that the most credible and defensible explanation would require an external, supernatural cause. Now, a natural event is one that can be described and explained appealing to the existing laws of this universe, the laws of physics of this universe. Now, since the cause must exist outside of the universe, outside of the effect, then whether mechanistic or personal, that cause would be supernatural, meaning it would exist outside of, over and above, or beyond this universe and the laws of physics of this universe. Holt elaborates further. He notes, the problem with the science option would seem to be this. The universe comprises everything that physically exists. Well, a scientific explanation must involve some sort of physical cause. But any physical cause is by definition a part of the universe to be explained. Thus, any purely scientific explanation of the existence of the universe is doomed to be circular. If there is an ultimate explanation for our contingent and perishable world, it would seemingly have to appeal to something that is both necessary and imperishable, which one might label God. Astronomer Alan Sandage is often credited with founding the modern discipline of observable astronomy. He stated at an Origins conference in 1985, "Here is evidence for what can only be described as a supernatural event. There is no way that this could have been predicted within the realm of physics as we know it." So Big Bang cosmology confirms the origin, the beginning of all matter, space, and time. So what is the cause of the Big Bang? Well, if the cause must exist outside of the universe, then that cause must transcend the matter, space, and time, as well as the laws of physics of this universe. Well, interestingly, over 3,000 years before Big Bang theory ever came about, the God of the Bible was described as just such a cause. Professor Louis Markos notes, "Though few realize it, the Bible is the only ancient book to claim that God created the world ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing. All other pagan nations, from the Greeks and the Romans to the Egyptians and the Babylonians to the Indians and the Scandinavians, believe that matter came first." Well, at this point, it's rather common for someone like Richard Dawkins to ask, okay, all right, well, tell me this. If God created the universe, who created God? And I'm astonished at the number of times that the atheist, by merely asking the question, then acts or behaves as if they've completely undermined the whole intelligibility of God. That it's completely irrational now that I've asked that question. I'm astonished because anyone who's familiar with philosophy will recognize it as being a very shallow and ineffectual critique. And in order to appreciate that and realize that, I'd like to take a look at another bigger question that's been asked for centuries. And that is, why is there something rather than nothing? Now that's a legitimate question that has been asked because it certainly seems plausible instead of the something that we all witness, we all enjoy, that there could have been nothing at all. So why is there something rather than nothing? Well, the possible answers to this would appear to be the following. Perhaps there was self-causation. Something is capable of creating itself. However, this defies the laws of logic because it suggests that something can exist and not exist at the same time. If it didn't exist in the first place, then how can it cause itself to come into existence? Now, even though there are a few that propose this, most find this wholly dissatisfying. Perhaps something arose from nothing. This effect of something arising from nothing would have no cause. Something simply popped into existence uncaused. And that's a very important point, because if there was a cause, then something else, meaning that cause itself, would already be in existence. This concept of something arising uncaused from nothing also seems completely irrational. And again, even though there are some that propose this as a solution, again, the vast majority find it wholly dissatisfying. Perhaps there's an eternal something. Something exists now because something has always existed. This eternal something had no beginning. That's very important. It's eternal. It's always been. There's no beginning. Therefore, there's no need to search for a cause of a beginning that never happened. This eternal something would be the first cause of everything else, or what philosophers call the uncaused cause. Now, many lay people have a very difficult time grasping this concept of an eternal first cause, or something that has existed forever and never had a beginning, or what philosophers refer to as the uncaused cause. But at this point, it would appear to be the most rational answer that is available to us. Something exists today because something has always existed. Recall Holt noting earlier, as long as the universe was thought to be eternal, its existence did not greatly vex scientists. So as Holt noted, many scientists thought that the universe itself was that eternal first cause. This is echoed in Carl Sagan's very famous statement, "The cosmos is all there is, ever was, or ever will be." So atheists do recognize the validity and, one might say, the rational necessity of an eternal first cause. The problem is that now Big Bang cosmology is demonstrating that the universe had a beginning. So it can't be that eternal first cause. Something else must be that cause. So the most credible explanation is that some other eternal first cause must exist outside of the universe. Now that eternal cause could be something, or it could be someone. Can this cause be explained via different laws of physics operating in a parallel universe? Or does this cause have a mind and intelligence? And how might we answer that question? Well, one way is to perhaps look for a marker or a signature of intelligence. Can we detect evidence of purpose, design, and intentionality in this universe? Those are known as teleological elements. Purpose, design, and intentionality are teleological elements. We're going to hear that phrase later in this presentation. I want you to understand what it's referring to. For the theist, the remaining lines of evidence are those markers or signatures of intelligence. And that's going to take us to our second line of evidence, which is universal fine-tuning. In 1998, Newsweek had a cover article titled, "Science Finds God." In that article, the author notes, "Physicists have stumbled on signs that the cosmos is custom-made for life and consciousness. It turns out that if the constants of nature, unchanging numbers like the strength of gravity, the charge of an electron, and the mass of a proton, were the tiniest bit different, then atoms would not hold together, stars would not burn, and life would have never made an appearance." The astrophysicist Paul Davies adds to this, "Recent discoveries about the primeval cosmos oblige us to accept that the expanding universe has been set in its motion with a cooperation of astonishing precision." The fact that the universe is finely tuned in order to permit life at this point is pretty uncontroversial within the scientific community. There are very few physicists who would dispute that. I think Stephen Hawking states it very plainly when he notes, "Whatever your point of view, the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." Since the scientific community readily acknowledges the finely tuned nature of the universe, I'm not going to spend my time detailing the wealth of evidence in support of it. Instead, what I'd rather do is talk about why this should be considered as a marker or a signature of intelligence, evidence on behalf of God. Now, if you were one of the first modern-day people to stumble upon Stonehenge, I think that you would agree that it would be perfectly logical, it would be perfectly rational to assume that it had been designed, engineered, and erected for a purpose. You wouldn't have to know when, you wouldn't have to know by whom, you wouldn't have to know how they built that structure. But appealing to sound logic and reason, you would have every right to believe that some form of intelligence was behind it. You would be justified in presuming intelligence for at least one of two reasons, and actually for both reasons. First of all, we know of no natural mechanism which can account for the structured order, precision, and the specificity of the structure. Perhaps more importantly, we do know that intelligent life forms are capable of such design, engineering, and assembly. So to reiterate the main point, it is based upon what we do know about such properties as order, precision, and specificity that combined, those properties require appealing to something else for an explanation. Those properties point beyond themselves, requiring a further explanation. Now, the finely tuned nature of the universe came as quite a surprise to scientists. It was most unexpected from a naturalistic perspective. However, once scientists began to acknowledge and grasp that the universe was finely tuned, they began to think, well, maybe there's some sort of a law that requires these constants, these values, to be adjusted in just this manner. Well, further scientific research has convinced most that there is no such law that determines these values be set where they are, and most today acknowledge that they very well could have been different. Well, the consequences of these findings is that on the surface they rationally suggest design. The eminent atheist and physicist Sir Fred Hoyle commented once, "I do not believe that any scientist who examined the evidence would fail to draw the inference that the laws of nuclear physics have been deliberately designed in regard to the consequences they produce." Hoyle would later in his career confess that nothing had shaken his atheism more than this discovery of universal fine-tuning. The theoretical physicist Tony Rothman once concluded an essay noting, "When confronted with the order and the beauty of the universe and the strange coincidences of nature, it's very tempting to take a leap of faith from science into religion. I'm sure many physicists want to. I only wish they would admit it." Another discovery that appears to be best explained by appealing to theism is the fact that all of these laws of physics can be expressed via a foundational language of mathematics. This foundational language of the laws of physics, again, seem to point beyond themselves, requiring a further and deeper level of intelligibility. The physicist Eugene Wigner has noted, "The enormous usefulness of mathematics and the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there is no rational explanation for it." I think it'd be more accurate to say that there's no rational explanation for it from a naturalistic perspective. That's because if the universe is the creation of a mind, then it would be entirely rational to learn that it had been built upon this foundation of mathematical expression. The professor of mathematics, Sir Roger Penrose, confesses that the laws of physics do seem to point beyond themselves, noting, "It is hard for me to believe that such superb theories could have arisen merely by some random natural selection of ideas, leaving only the good ones as survivors. The good ones are simply much too good to be the survivors of ideas that have arisen in a random way. There must be instead some deep underlying reason for the accord between mathematics and physics." And the former physicist John Polkinghorne, who later in life would actually become an Anglican priest, he once summarized it this way, "Albert Einstein once said that the only mystery of the universe is that it is comprehensible. Well, things are more mysterious than that, for it has been proved time and again that mathematics provides the key to unlock the secrets of the cosmos. It would be intolerably intellectually lazy just to shrug one's shoulders and say, that's just the way it is." Science has found that the universe is profoundly, rationally transparent and beautiful. The feeling of wonder at the marvelous order of the world is a fundamental experience in physics. The laws of physics seem to point beyond themselves, calling for an explanation of why they have this rational character. And the geneticist Francis Collins rhetorically asks, "Are these mathematical descriptions of reality signposts to some greater intelligence? Is mathematics, along with DNA, another language of God?" Well, Collins' quote is an excellent segue into our third line of evidence, and that is the origin of life and biological information. So in 1866, Charles Darwin noted, "Though I expect that at some future time the origin of life will be rendered intelligible, at present it seems to me beyond the confines of science." Almost 150 years later, in his book, Richard Dawkins confesses, "We know little more than Darwin did about how life got started in the first place." Again, I think it would be fair to say what Dawkins means is that we know little more from a naturalistic perspective how life got started. Because over the last 150 years, we have learned a tremendous amount more than Darwin ever knew. And what we have learned has only increased the difficulty of a naturalistic explanation immeasurably. So what we have learned is that amino acids are the basic building blocks of life. In life, there are roughly 20 different types of amino acids that can be strung together in order to form a protein. Now hang in with me here, okay? We're going to be talking some biology. And my experience is that when you talk biology, people's eyes just glaze over and they check out. So I'm going to really try and keep it simple. And all I'm asking is that you hang in and you just get the gist, okay? You just get the gist. So think of amino acids as letters that are strung together in order to form sentences or paragraphs or small chapters of a book, if you will. So in the same way that letters need to be arranged in a specific order in order to form a coherent sentence or paragraph, amino acids have to be strung together in a specific sequence in order to form a functioning protein. Now, the smallest of proteins is going to have anywhere from about 100 to 150 amino acid sequence. Most proteins will have hundreds of amino acids in their sequence. Now, in addition to the problem of their specific arrangement, each of the amino acids must be left-handed. So in nature, what we find is a roughly 50-50 mixture, what scientists call a racemic mixture of left-handed and right-handed amino acids. And so the question becomes, what sort of a naturalistic mechanism can somehow sort out all of the left-handed amino acids so that only left-hand amino acids can be selected to form, to sequence a protein? Now, this is known as the homochirality problem. Now, Dr. Fazale Rana is a biochemist, and he wrote a book titled The Origins of Life, and I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at Southwestern University in September. And in the Q&A, he was asked what he thought was the greatest hurdle to a naturalistic explanation to the origin of life. Well, he said that, actually there's a lot of extremely difficult hurdles at this point, but he thought this issue of homochirality was probably the highest and the most difficult. He summarizes this in his book, noting, Stanford organic chemist William Bonner, considered the world's foremost authority on homochirality, offered this summation, quote, I spent 25 years looking for terrestrial mechanisms for homochirality and trying to investigate them, and I didn't find any supporting evidence. Terrestrial explanations are impotent and non-viable. In a detailed review of homochirality's origin, Bonner concluded that the source must be extraterrestrial. Now, proteins are not alive in and of themselves. Instead, they just simply act as automated machines doing most of the critical functions within the cell. Many refer to them as the workhorses of life. And a typical cell uses thousands of different proteins. I'm going to repeat that. A typical cell uses thousands of different proteins. At present, origin of life researchers don't have a naturalistic explanation for the origin of even a single protein. Now, in addition, we've learned about what's called life's minimal complexity. So in mapping the genomes of microbes, we have learned that the very smallest genomes of independent life forms contain roughly 1,500 to 1,900 gene products. Now, gene product refers to proteins and functional RNAs, but just think of gene products as little biological machines. Okay, so the smallest genome of independent life forms contain roughly 1,500 to 1,900 biological machines. Now, most origin of life researchers believe that current microbes evolved from even simpler life forms way in the past. So, further research has attempted to identify which of the roughly 1,500 gene products are absolutely indispensable for life. Well, theoretical and experimental studies seem to indicate that life requires a minimum of somewhere between 250 to 300 different proteins in order to carry out its most basic functions. So Dr. Rana summarizes the current difficulty in origin of life research. He notes, the problem for the origin of life extends beyond trying to account for the simultaneous occurrence of over 250 different proteins. It also demands the appearance of DNA, RNA, and complex carbohydrates to form the cell wall, plus the lipids to form the cell's membrane. All these molecules must come together at once and operate in an orchestrated fashion for life to be possible. In 2012, the internationally respected atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel, in his book Mind and Cosmos, details the current state of origin of life research. He notes, no viable account, even a purely speculative one, seems to be available for how a system as staggeringly functionally complex and information-rich as a self-reproducing cell controlled by DNA, RNA, or some other predecessor could have arisen by chemical evolution alone from a dead environment. And recognition of the problem is not limited to the defenders of intelligent design. Now, the acronym SETI stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And so the SETI researchers, in their search for alien intelligence, are concentrating their efforts on trying to detect a signal emanating from space that has information. As we all know, information is a marker or a signature of intelligence. Carl Sagan has stated that, or he did state that, it would only require detecting a single signal that contained information to convince us that there are other intelligences in this universe besides ourselves. Now, although we have yet to detect a signal coming from space containing information, we have found an abundance of information within life, within the cell, for which must be accounted. The origin of life researcher Bernd Olaf Coopers has noted, the problem of the origin of life is clearly basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. So the genetic code was discovered when Francis Crick proposed that the nucleotide bases in DNA likely functioned like the alphabetical letters in a text or like the binary digits that you find in a software or a machine code. So this led him to propose the existence of yet undiscovered communication molecules, enzymes, and a code. So it wasn't until a scientist began thinking in terms of human engineering and language that we actually predicted and then discovered the genetic code. Dr. Stephen Myers asks, is this significant? In fact, it's profoundly mysterious. Apart from the molecules comprising the gene expression system and the machinery of the cell, sequences or structures exhibiting such specified complexity or specified information are not found anywhere in the natural world, that is, the non-human world. Myers' point is that the only known source of such specified complex information comes from intelligent beings, specifically noting humans. Now, as in the Stonehenge example from before, we should infer a creator not simply because naturalistic explanations appear to be incapable of explaining the information, engineering, and design that we find within the cell, but because the information, engineering, and design that we do find in the cell is directly comparable to that which intelligence produces. And that's going to lead us to our fourth and final line of evidence, and that is the existence of the mind consisting of a conscious self, free will, and rationality. Now, most people believe that they have a mind or a soul that is non-physical and that it directs the body, which is strictly physical, and this is often referred to as Cartesian dualism. We experience having a conscious self that is immaterial and non-physical and which appears to direct the physical. This conscious self also appears to be unified, meaning that even though the cells of my physical body continue to change over my lifetime, mentally, I'm still the same self that I was at the age of 15 or 25, 35, 45, etc. We experience the ability to think and act freely. I presume that all of you chose to be here. I hope none of you were forced to be here against your will. We presume that we have the mental faculties to exhibit rationality. We each experience the cognitive ability to gather, recognize, and understand truth. The conscious self, free will, and rationality is extremely difficult and challenging to account for from an atheistic perspective. The internationally respected philosopher of the mind, John Searle, elaborates on the difficulty. He notes, the central question in philosophy at the beginning of the 21st century is how to give an account of ourselves as apparently conscious, mindful, free, rational agents in a world that science tells us consists entirely of mindless, meaningless physical particles. The problem is to give a completely satisfying materialistic account of the mind that does not end up denying the obvious fact that we all intrinsically have conscious and intentional states. Standard versions of materialism over the last century, I have to confess that I think that all of these theories are hopelessly inadequate. Searle's despair is understandable. Materialistic naturalism seems incapable of accounting for the conscious self, free will, and rationality that we all experience. There would appear to be no naturalistic way to start with mindless, meaningless, strictly physical, law-governed matter and then generating the sort of agents who are able to think and act freely, whose will and actions are no longer controlled by or determined or governed by the laws of nature. Now, if it's impossible to explain these from a naturalistic perspective, then the committed materialist often finds that they have no choice but to simply deny that these actually exist, that it's an illusion. For example, in regard to the self, the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume argues that there is no such thing as a unified self. He suggested that these experiences that we attribute to a unified self are nothing more than a bundle of sensations or perceptions. It is an illusion to think that something exists over and above these individual sensations. When it comes to free will, Cornell professor William Provine states, quote, "Free will as it is traditionally conceived, the freedom to make uncoerced and unpredictable choices among alternative possible courses of action, simply does not exist. There is no way the evolutionary processes as currently conceived can produce a being that is truly free to make choices." When it comes to rationality, Baron de Holbach was an 18th century philosopher, and he was a contemporary of David Hume. He's perhaps best known for the book that he wrote that many call the Bible for atheists. In his book, he very candidly describes the deterministic nature of man's existence. He notes, "Man's life is a line that nature commands him to describe upon the surface of the earth without his ever being able to swerve from it, even for an instant. He is born without his own consent. His organization does in no wise depend upon himself. His ideas come to him involuntarily. He is increasingly modified by causes, whether visible or concealed, over which he has no control, which necessarily regulate his mode of existence, give the hue to his way of thinking, and determine his manner of acting. He is good or bad, happy or miserable, wise or foolish, reasonable or irrational, without his will." Now, David Hume was an atheist who was committed to a naturalistic explanation of mankind, and so as noted earlier, this caused him to deny the existence of an immaterial self. If you're committed to materialism, you can't acknowledge anything that is immaterial. And his writings on the subject have been very influential throughout Western philosophy. Now, John Searle recognizes the persuasive forcefulness of Hume's arguments. As a matter of fact, he says that some of Hume's writings on the subject may be some of the greatest prose in all of Western philosophy. Nevertheless, Searle confesses we cannot deny what appears to be self-evidently obvious to each of us. We are rationally required to acknowledge a self. Searle notes, "It is an illusion," Hume tells us, "to suppose that there is something over and above the specific experiences that constitute myself." I think that Hume's arguments at the level that they are directed are quite convincing, and I believe that many, perhaps most, philosophers agree with me about the power of Hume's argument. But I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that Hume left something out. Do we need to postulate something in addition to the bodies and the sequence of our experiences? I've come to the conclusion that yes, we absolutely must postulate a self in addition to the sequence of experiences. The first thing to notice is we do not have disordered experiences. Rather, all of the experiences I have at any instant are experiences as a part of a single, unified conscious field. Furthermore, the continuation of that conscious field throughout time is experienced by the possessor of that conscious field as a continuation of his or her own consciousness. That is, I do not experience my consciousness of 5 minutes ago or even 5 years ago as disconnected from my present consciousness. Rather, I have the experience of a continuous consciousness. The arguments that convince me that we need to postulate at least a formal notion of the self have to do with the notions of rationality, free choice, decision-making, and reasons for action. We have to suppose that in addition to the bundle of perceptions as described by Hume, there are certain formal constraints on the entity that makes the decisions and carries out the actions. We have to postulate a rational self or agent that is capable of acting freely and capable of assuming responsibility for actions. It is the complex of the notions of free action, explanation, responsibility, and reason that give us the motivation for postulating something in addition to the sequence of experiences and the body in which they occur. Neo-Darwinian evolution claims to be able to take a simple organism and to eventually create a complex biological machine. The belief is that over time, this mechanism can fully develop this, again, intricate biological machine. However, there's nothing in evolutionary theory that has the power to create what many philosophers call the ghost in the machine. The conscious self, free will, and rationality all appear to require something that is independent of the machine itself, something that directs and operates the machine, something whose will and actions are not governed or controlled by the laws of nature. So philosopher Roy Abraham Varghese reasons why all of the above should be counted as evidence on behalf of a creator. He begins by elaborating on perhaps the most famous phrase in all of philosophy. That's Descartes' assertion, "I think, therefore I am." Varghese asks, well, who is this I? Where is it? How did it come to be? Your self is obviously not just something physical. It is an embodied self, an ensouled body. You are not in a particular brain cell or in some part of your body. No, the cells in your body keep changing, and yet you remain the same. If you study your neurons, you will find that none of them have the property of being an I. Life, consciousness, mind, and the self can only come from a source that is living, conscious, and thinking. If we are centers of consciousness and thought, who are able to know and love, intend and execute, I cannot see how such centers could come from something that is itself incapable of all of these activities. It's simply inconceivable that any material matrix or field can generate agents who think and act. Matter cannot produce conceptions and perceptions. A force field does not plan or think. So at the level of reason and everyday experience, we become immediately aware that the world of living, conscious, thinking beings has to originate in a living source, a mind. Earlier we addressed the question, why is there something rather than nothing? It seemed most rational to conclude, well, something exists now because something has always existed. Now it seems appropriate to ask the question, well, why does someone exist rather than no one? It also seems similarly appropriate to think, it seems very plausible that instead of the someones, all of the persons that we know and we love and we interact with, there could have been no one at all. Why is there someone rather than no one? Varghese' point is that it also seems equally plausible, equally rational to conclude that someone exists today because someone has always existed. Now, occasionally on forensic files, even after all the evidence has been gathered, there will still be some who are obstinately unwilling to accept the conclusions that have been suggested by the facts. In one episode, the father was found guilty and convicted of killing the mother, and yet despite the wealth of forensic evidence that led to the conviction, both children refused to believe that the father actually committed the crime. They refused to believe that he was even capable of committing the crime. One of the things that we always have to keep in mind is that some people hold on to worldviews that inhibit or distort their ability to reach truthful conclusions. Philosopher of the mind John Searle elaborates on why some philosophers still cling to materialistic naturalism despite the evidence. He notes, Why are so many philosophers driven to deny certain common sense claims, such as we really do have conscious thoughts and feelings, that we do have real intentional states such as beliefs, hopes, fears, and desires? Well, the answer: we must be able to give an account of all there is to be said about the real world in completely materialistic terms. The existence of some irreducible mental phenomenon does not fit in, and it seems intellectually repulsive. It is indigestible. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel, who I referred to earlier in his book Mind and Cosmos, it is very interestingly subtitled, "Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False." In the book, Nagel very honestly confesses, "The inadequacies of the naturalistic and reductionist picture seem to be real. There are things that science as presently conceived does not help us to understand, and which we can see from the internal features of the physical science that it is not going to explain. The origin and evolution of life and mind will not be explainable by physics and chemistry alone. An expanded but unified form of explanation will be needed, and I suspect it will have to include teleological elements." There's that phrase again. Andrew Ferguson is the senior editor of the Weekly Standard magazine, and he did a review of Nagel's book. And he was very sympathetic in regard to the evidence which led to Nagel's consternation. And he noted, "The Neo-Darwinian materialistic account offers a picture of the world that is unrecognizable to us, a world without free will, or consciousness, or good, or evil, or selves, or, when it comes to that, selflessness. Materialism is an explanation for a world we don't live in. If the materialist neo-Darwinian orthodoxy contradicts common sense, then this is a mark against the orthodoxy, not against common sense. When a chain of reasoning leads us to deny the obvious, we should double-check the chain of reasoning before we give up on the obvious." Nagel has concluded that any ultimate explanation of reality is going to require appealing to teleological elements. Recall that teleological elements are purpose, design, and intentionality. So based upon the evidence alone, Nagel recognizes that in order to explain reality, it's going to have to include these ideas of purpose, design, and intentionality. Yet in his book, he still attempts to disconnect this from any concept or any idea of a creator. Why, you might ask? It seems so rational. Well, he confesses his preference for an imminent natural explanation is congruent with his atheism. He's a committed atheist. He will not entertain the idea of God. Ferguson elaborates further in his article. He notes, "Nagel admits that he finds the evident failure of materialism as a worldview alarming, precisely because the alternative is, for a secular intellectual, unthinkable." Ferguson then quotes Nagel. So Nagel says, quote, "I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope that there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." Now, in a way, I think that we really have to appreciate and give Nagel credit for his intellectual honesty, because he confesses it's not the evidence that drives his conviction. No, he just doesn't want to believe in God. Similar to the children that refuse to believe that their father would have committed that crime, he chooses not to follow the evidence where it logically leads. We always have to keep that in mind as we're talking. But however, for those that are willing to follow the argument wherever it leads, the evidence has been very compelling. Francis Collins, at one time, was the head of the Human Genome Project, and he's currently considered to be one of the great scientists in the world. He published a book in 2005 titled The Language of God, and in that he details how he grew up in an in an agnostic home, but when he left home, he very quickly became an atheist. However, he said as a physician, he was always struck by the power of faith in the lives of many of his patients, and he began to realize that he had never really given the idea of God a chance. He had never really thought it through. And then once he began to study the evidence, he concluded faith in God seemed more rational than disbelief. Collins is now an openly evangelical Christian. Alan Sandage was a graduate assistant of Edwin Hubble, and he was perhaps best known for establishing the accurate value of the Hubble constant in the age of the universe. As I noted previously, he also is credited with founding the modern discipline of astronomy. Later in life, he would become a Christian, and he noted, "I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence. Why there is something rather than nothing." Philosopher Anthony Flew was at one time considered the world's most notorious atheist. He wrote numerous books espousing atheism, and he participated in frequent debates with theists. He claims to have admired the Platonic declaration that we should always follow the argument wherever it leads. He claims to have adopted that mantra as his personal philosophy. In 2004, he shocked the world when he announced that he had changed his mind and he now thought that a belief in God was rationally necessary. He was being interviewed by one of his frequent debating opponents, Gary Habermas, and Habermas asked him, "Which arguments for God's existence do you find most persuasive?" Flew responded, "I think that the most impressive arguments for God's existence are those that are supported by recent scientific discoveries. I think the argument to intelligent design is enormously stronger than it was when I first met it. It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new, enormously powerful argument to design." In 2007, Flew co-authored the book titled "There Is a God." Had the very clever cover with the word "no" struck through, replaced with an A, indicating his change of mind. In chapter 4, he states, "I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. I believe that this universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. I believe that life and reproduction originate in a divine source. Why do I believe this? Well, the short answer is this. This is the world picture, as I see it, that has emerged from modern science. When I finally came to recognize the existence of God, it was not a paradigm shift because my paradigm remains. We must follow the argument wherever it leads." In his concluding chapter, Flew reiterates, "I must say again that the journey to my discovery of the divine has thus far been a pilgrimage of reason. I have followed the argument where it has led me, and it has led me to accept the existence of a self-existent, immutable, immaterial, omnipotent, and omniscient being." Now back to forensic files. Once investigators have established the work of an outside agent are required in order to satisfactorily explain the evidence, they then move on to the who, what, where, when, and why questions of the case. This evening we've asked the question, does God exist? But there are other very important questions that remain. If God does exist, is this the God of the Bible? Is the Bible the Word of God? Is Jesus the Son of God? Does my life have purpose? Is there an afterlife? Do heaven and hell exist? And if so, can I know where I will reside? Well, these are also questions of great importance. And in the 1600s, the great physicist, mathematician, and philosopher Blaise Pascal reasoned, if we answer yes to these questions, and in the end it turns out that we're wrong, then we really will have risked very little. But if we answer no to these questions, or we fail to even entertain or consider these questions, then the risks could be eternally significant. Now, Pascal's point was not that we should err on the side of caution, and that we should just go ahead and answer yes to those questions and cross our fingers and say, okay, just in case, I'm covered. If it goes down, I'm covered. That wasn't Pascal's point at all. His point was that the balance of risk and reward behooves us to entertain, consider, and answer those questions as best we can. Now, those questions will require different lines of conversation and appeals to different lines of evidence. But now that we have looked at the question, does God exist, and have shown that perhaps the most compelling, the most rational answer is yes, then I would encourage each of you to pursue the lines of evidence that will allow you to answer and address those remaining questions. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.